Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today, our last effective day, although the day after our last Zoom meeting day, our last effective day before the break, I'm going to continue our study of medieval Europe. And today, I really want to talk about a few different things relating to the idea of the Middle Ages in Europe or the medieval period. We talked about the decline of Rome and how, whoops, alarm going off, how the Middle Ages is something that happened after that. This meeting comes with musical accompaniment, I guess. There we go. Alarm I set. The Middle Ages or medieval period was something that happened after the fall of Rome. But today I want to talk a little bit more about the debates around it and talk about some of the major players, folks that would be good to know. This class basically goes up to the year 1000 AD or CE, depending on which naming system you want to use. And that's where we're going to stop things effectively. But we'll look at some important players up until that time period, and we'll look at the nature of this time period. And I'll ask you guys, what do you think of this time period? So without further ado, let's switch over to looking at some materials here. So the big name we're going to be talking about is Charlemagne. So I'll talk about him more in a second. But our topic here is the medieval world. So there's a few different names for this time period. Sometimes it's called the Middle Ages. Sometimes it's just called the medieval period, which is basically just French for middle, but it doesn't quite as much reference this idea of middle period. And in older history textbooks, it used to be called the Dark Ages. So like I said with the Greek Dark Age, there's two different ways you can interpret the idea of a dark age. You can interpret it as meaning a dark as in bad, it's a bad time to be alive, or you can interpret it as meaning a time that is dark to historians. We can't tell what's going on because there's not a lot of writing usually, or some other factors are obscuring the information that we'd like to have. Now, people might mean to say that part, the idea about not having a lot of writing, but in practice, they usually ended up implying it was dark, it was bad. And a lot of our sort of stereotypes of this time period, which is basically the 400s, any time after the fall of Rome, whenever you want to say that, but probably the 400s onward to the 1400s, which was kind of the start of the modern period. That time period has been usually described as bad in some ways, as negative. People are suffering, people are not living as good of lives, and that's the stereotype. But the more historians have taken a look at it, the more it turns out it's not quite that simple. And a lot of the things we stereotype as really negative, like witch burnings, the Black Plague, really happen at the very end of this time period. I mean, the witch burnings don't even really happen until the 1600s, really. I mean, there was an idea of witches, but not really witch burnings as a big thing. So a lot of our information, that's one of the advantages of a class like this is we can kind of rethink what we thought of the time period. At the same time, maybe we can swing too far in the other direction because there are some things that were cool about the Roman Empire and the Greek Hellenistic civilizations that weren't true in this time period. And I'm going to talk a bit about what that means. And in the end, maybe we can draw our own conclusions as to whether it was a good time to be alive or a bad time to be alive. So one way of thinking about this is when we're debating the time period, was the Middle Ages more like the video game The Legend of Zelda, which is based on the Middle Ages, or was it more like Dark Souls, which is also based on the Middle Ages? Now, these two video games are, one of the many, many pop cultural things that are influenced by this idea of the Middle Ages or the medieval time period. And of course, professional historians use this framing all the time. No, actually, it's just something that I made up. But I think actually looking at how the idea of medievalness is being depicted in these two games actually kind of illuminates the debate really nicely. The older way of thinking about the Middle Ages used to be like the video game Dark Souls, in which basically everybody is kind of zombie There's just a lot of dead people running around. Things have completely collapsed into ruins. The old people who used to be in power are completely gone. Everything's falling apart, and like it's really bad. It's just a situation where it feels apocalyptic. Everything is just totally gone, and there's this sense that there used to be some great stuff going on, but now it's just death and disease and dying, a lot of dying. Um, the more modern view of the Middle Ages is a lot more actually like the recent Legend of Zelda game, which also has a sort of destruction of an old empire. This is the recent Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And in this game, you play 100 years after a calamity has destroyed the whole region, except it hasn't really destroyed the whole region. What's mostly destroyed is the capital and the main town areas in the center on the map right here. When you go to other towns outside of that area, belonging to the different creatures of this fantasy world, you find that their towns are doing all right. And you got towns over here that are doing all right, and towns that are here doing all right. So around the edges, things are fine, and they really haven't changed that much. But in the center, you have this desolation and these ruins. That is a lot more like what people think of the fall of the Roman Empire and medieval Europe, because the big sort of power centers of ancient Rome collapsed, fell into this gradual decline that we were talking about last time. And those ones kind of fell apart. But the edges, the places that they had been ruling, didn't really see their lives change all that much. And in some ways, you could think of the shift from the Roman time period to the medieval time period as a shift from the center to the edges, or maybe saying instead of them being edges anymore, they're new centers. One thing to think about, London was just kind of an outpost of Rome. It was a muddy, like trading post set up on a river far away from Rome. And eventually it would become one of the most important cities in the world as the British tried to take over the world. So it's that kind of shift that we see in the Middle Ages, and it's gradual, but that might be one of the most important things that happens in the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, back in Rome, and the sort of old former big cities of Rome, there was a sense that something grand and beautiful had been lost. A lot of people sort of lived in and around the ruins or were familiar with them, but not in the other towns outside of these areas. Or a town might have a familiarity with, like, that used to be an old Roman fort, but obviously the Romans aren't around anymore. And we barely, hundreds of years later, barely really know who they were. But in the city of Rome, we see some interesting stuff going on. For instance, in the old forums that the emperors built, you just find people building new buildings. Like, here's a depiction of what is basically people building their own little tiny farms in what was a sort of declined place, living amongst the marble columns. And some of the marble columns got stripped away so that people could use them in other buildings. That's basically how ruins happen, is people kind of start taking apart, or they fall apart over time due to earthquakes and things like that. But yeah, here's some people just living their sheep in what used to be the Roman meeting place. In Rome, we see again that shift from the center to the edges or to a new center. So if we look at the map of Rome, which it might look kind of familiar to you from when we were looking at for Minecraft Rome, this used to be the center of downtown in Rome, the area around those two big hills I was showing you. But in the Middle Ages, the most important building in the city of Rome is the Basilica of St. Peter. That was built on the edges because Christians were not originally popular in Rome. They were outsiders, they were outcasts. And so they took the only land that they could available to them. And so they built it over here on the Vatican Hill. Well, now that's the most important building in Rome. So in the Middle Ages, this is the center of the population. People have moved out of the buildings over here, and they're living over here to be closer to St. Peter's Basilica. So they've gone towards what's more important, and they've moved closer to the edges. So that's some of the patterns that you might see. And I should mention, in all this talk of decline and change, we're really only talking about the former area of the Roman Empire and about Europe. Other places did not decline so much. We're going to talk about an empire in Germany in a second here, but that's a bit of a later development. Um, like I said, we have the Byzantine Empire over here, which, despite declining in terms of its territory, keeps up its empire for basically about 1,000 years, which is pretty impressive. So it kind of holds onto this territory for a really long time, and it has its thriving city of Constantinople, which is the center of the operation. We also have the caliphate of Islam, which one of the major centers is here in Spain. The others are in North Africa and what we now call the Middle East, but was then just called, Sumeria and Persia and Arabia. So one of the biggest centers is in Cairo, which is basically taking over the former Egyptian territory and using Egyptian agriculture to really thrive. They could grow a lot of food on the Nile River. Baghdad is that big center of knowledge and learning that we talked about. And then Mecca is, of course, the most important Muslim holy city. So the Muslims are sitting pretty during this time period. And it's striking that their culture seems kind of cut off from European culture. We have these Christians where the church is powerful, but the population is not very high. And, they're not doing as much science and learning and things like that. But not too far away, in territory that was also formerly part of the Roman Empire, we have this caliphate where they are doing that sort of expansion and economic growth and high population and knowledge and learning. So how you feel about those things really is kind of how you feel about the quality of life in medieval Europe during this time period. But medieval Europe was kind of the only group of people who were really going through that problem at that point. One thing that we notice in the fall of the empire is a decline of common knowledge. For instance, there was a certain kind of wall building technique that it seemed like everybody in Rome, in the Roman Empire, knew how to do. They learned it from each other. It was just the kind of stuff that you would learn from stonemasons, was how to build walls in this particular way. Well, in Europe, they ended up having all these walls, but forgetting how do you build those kinds of walls? So because they were no longer connected to the networks of knowledge that they had previously had. So I feel like that's the kind of stuff that's going on, is these sort of networks fall apart more than anything else. But some historians have argued that networks don't fall apart completely. In particular, there's the idea of trade that is still going on pretty strong in the former area of Roman Europe. One author of a book called Barbarians to Angels actually made the point that there was a certain amount of Roman culture that survived among the German kings. Even though there were no emperors, these kings, they used a lot of the art styles of Rome and benefited from some of the same trade networks that Romans had been using. For instance, this German king, in his tomb, we found that he had these beautiful golden bees, which we believe are imported from the caliphate, all the way from Baghdad or someplace like that. So he was able to have access to wealth, maybe not as immediately or on the same scale as the Roman emperor, but he was doing all right for himself and pretty well connected. So it's really, I think it's really has a lot to do with how you feel about things like expansion, growing population, and scientific development, which isn't to say that science was completely forgotten in that time period either, but I would say some information was lost. But as Peter Wells has pointed out, you may have even lived longer in some parts of medieval Germany than you did in the Roman Empire, because they had certain knowledge of health that was important to them that they had already figured out. So there's a lot of debate here. But I think there, just as we saw a movement in the city, we're going to see a movement from Rome over here being the center of power to centers of power being more in the middle of Europe, or the middle of Western Europe, I should say, over here. And this has a lot to do with a guy called Charlemagne. All right, so who is Charlemagne? Well, Charlemagne is a weird sort of name that we give him. His name could be Charles, Carl, Carolus, Carl with a K. And he has the nickname the Great because he was a pretty successful king, living in the 700s and 800s. Charlemagne just means Karl the Great, basically. And at this point, there wasn't a clear distinction between French and German culture. So he is kind of the ancestor of both. And his family were known as the Carolingians, which is also where we get the name Carol and whatnot, or Carolus. All these names are connected. And the Carols had been conquering Europe and establishing an empire, but they did not start off as Romans. They didn't have any really strong connection to Roman culture. They were on the periphery, but they started getting involved with making some powerful connections. For one thing, they conquered an empire, same empire that we see right here, and they managed to conquer their way down into Rome, at least during some points. But their main area is, as you see, France and Germany right here. And so Charlemagne is considered an ancestor of both. Now, he wasn't the first to do the conquering, but he sort of had the empire at its fullest extent. And if we look at more of these territories, you can see a little bit more detail here, but we don't need to get into all that. But the sort of maximum extent stretched just all the way down into Rome and covered this territory here. And Charlemagne made a powerful ally in terms of making some kind of connection to this legacy of Roman culture, which is he became friends with the Pope. Now, I'm going to talk in a second about how important the Pope is, and how the Pope became important, because it seems like there wasn't always a clear idea that the Pope was the leader of all of Christianity or all of Roman Catholic Christianity. There were time periods where that was a bit less clear, or more debated, we shall say. But Charlemagne and Pope Leo III basically made an alliance. And Charlemagne, on Christmas of the year 800, which I like because it's a nice round number to remember, in the year 800, Pope Leo declared him and crowned him the official Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it kind of doesn't mean anything necessarily. It meant that Charlemagne had an empire, sort of, but it wasn't really based out of Rome. It was based out of his own capital city, Aachen. It was more of an Aachen empire that happened to have Rome in it, and only temporarily at that. But it was a good move for Charlemagne, right? What did it get him? Let's think about that. What it got him, right, was that he was being endorsed as somehow Roman, as an heir to the Roman Empire and having Roman authority, which was, of course, going to be recognized in some way as significant. So, yeah, we have a new Roman emperor. Well, not really. He's not really a Roman emperor unless you really stretch it. But the Pope gives his blessing, and that gives him a certain significance. The Pope is probably the most important person in the city of Rome right now, because the church there is the most important thing about Rome right now. And so Charlemagne is endorsed by the Pope. And then conversely, Charlemagne basically endorses the Pope in turn. He says, yeah, this guy should be the leader of Christianity. The Bishop of Rome was what the Pope was sort of referred to in the early stages of Christianity. And there is a debate between different denominations of Christianity. Should the Pope be thought of as the leader of the religion? Should the Bishop of Rome be this important head of all things? And Charlemagne basically was one who established or said that, yes, he should be important. So the Pope and the Charlemagne are helping each other out very effectively. And despite all this, the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne was a bit of, propped up on sort of, presentation. A famous philosopher, Voltaire, once quipped that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I think it was kind of an empire, but you can make an argument that it was just a really big kingdom. But it wasn't Roman, really, and it was only holy to the extent that the Pope had endorsed it. And the other thing about it is that it fell apart after Charlemagne. His sons did not continue. Basically, there was a real problem during this time period of you have this empire, but then your sons are supposed to split it between them. So the empire didn't last after Charlemagne died. So it wasn't really able to turn it into a long-lasting empire. But it was a significant moment in history, mainly because this was one reason to move from the old center to a new center. Basically, if you've noticed that the center of power over time seems to move northwest, we have maybe first Athens, and then we have Rome, and then we have Aachen, and then eventually we have London, the most powerful people in the world. This is sort of gradually moving over time. And this is a big moment in defining who's in charge. And another way this is defining who's in charge is notice that Charlemagne's Frankish Empire, his Holy Roman Empire, doesn't include any of Africa or Spain or Greece or Egypt or anything like that. And so this is sort of, we're used to looking at this map of Europe. This is what Europe is. But the Romans didn't really have this idea of Europe as being important. Charlemagne was maybe the first person to think that way, because if he's in the center over here, Europe is this region that he can get to from anywhere. And he's not thinking about Africa at all, or what we call the Middle East at all. So this is kind of making this part of the world into the place that is most significant, at least in Charlemagne's eyes. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. Did it continue to be important because of Charlemagne, or did people like Charlemagne because this part of the world continued to be important? I think it may just be that they wanted to, celebrate him after the fact, but because it became so important, he is important in being one of the first people to be thinking in those terms. Okay, in the next video, I want to talk about the changes in religion and meet some more of our cast of characters who live in this time of Charlemagne.